Hi, and welcome to my presentation on Chapter 14, the Autonomic Nervous System. So before we get into the autonomic nervous system specifically, we'll just kind of do a general review of the layout of the peripheral nervous system. So again, the peripheral nervous system is the cranial and spinal nerves in the body, and it's divided into the sensory division and the motor division. The sensory division is all of the information coming from sensory receptors and traveling into the central nervous system, and the motor division is all of the motor information or motor commands coming from the central nervous system and traveling out to the muscles and glands of the body. The sensory division is subdivided into the somatic sensory division and the visceral sensory division. The somatic sensory division is all of the senses that you are consciously aware of. The visceral sensory division is all of the sensory information that you are not consciously aware of, mostly related to stretch in various organs. The motor division is also subdivided into the somatic motor division and the visceral motor division, which is also called the autonomic nervous system. So the somatic motor division controls your skeletal muscles, so it's the stuff that you are voluntarily able to control. The visceral motor division, also known as the autonomic nervous system, is controlling all of the muscles and glands in your body that you cannot consciously control, which would be everything except for your skeletal muscle. So it's the smooth muscle in various organs, the cardiac muscle in your heart, and all of the different glands in your body. Then the autonomic nervous system is further subdivided into the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system, which we will go into more detail on in a moment. Oh, right here. So the sympathetic nervous system is abbreviated as the SNS. It's associated with fight versus flight, but it's not only activated during emergencies, it's also activated, just regularly throughout the day. And then you also have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is abbreviated the PNS, and it's associated with rest and digest. So the sympathetic nervous system is coordinating responses from the visceral organs of the body that are appropriate for fight versus flight situations. So for instance, it would speed up your heart rate or increase your blood pressure to prepare you, to fight or run away from something. The parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, is coordinating functions in your visceral organs or coordinating behavior in your visceral organs that is compatible with resting and digesting. So it's going to slow your heart rate down, reduce your blood pressure, increase the function of your digestive system. Most of the organs in your body, most of the internal organs in your body are going to be innervated by both the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, which means that they are contacted by axons of both the SNS and the PNS, and they're controlled both by the SNS and the PNS. There are a few exceptions. Most notably is the blood vessels. Your blood vessels are only contacted or innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic nervous system has no direct way to control or influence the blood vessels at all. Only the sympathetic nervous system controls the blood vessels. But apart from that, most of your other major internal organs are going to be controlled by both divisions of the autonomic nervous system. And in general, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system will always have opposite effects on the organs that they control. So, for instance, with the heart, the sympathetic nervous system increases the heart rate, the parasympathetic nervous system decreases the heart rate. So we'll go over kind of the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system, and then we'll get into its function. And we're mostly going to be focusing on how the sympathetic nervous system differs from the parasympathetic nervous system. But they also share some things in common. So you have, for all nerves in the autonomic nervous system, you have two basic neurons that are participating in carrying that autonomic information from the central nervous system to the target organs that are being controlled by the autonomic nervous system. The first neuron is called the preganglionic neuron, and the second neuron is the postganglionic neuron. The cell body for the preganglionic neuron is located in the spinal cord most of the time, but sometimes in the brainstem. It sends its axon out of the spinal cord or out from the brainstem on a cranial nerve, and it will travel to a ganglion. And then inside of that ganglion, you have the cell body for your postganglionic neuron, and the axon for that neuron will leave the ganglion and travel the rest of the way to the target organ. So that's quite different from how nerves work for the rest of the peripheral nervous system. So as you remember from chapter 13, for your sensory neurons, they all have their cell bodies. The first order sensory neurons all have their cell bodies in the posterior root ganglion, and their axon enters a spinal cord and synapses onto a second order sensory neuron. Then for your somatic motor division, you have a lower motor neuron whose cell body is in the spinal cord, and its axon leaves the spinal cord and just travels to whatever muscle it is innervating. So for the autonomic nervous system, the cell body that is in the spinal cord is the preganglionic cell body. Its axon exits the spinal cord and travels to a ganglion. In that ganglion, you have the cell body for the postganglionic neuron, and that neuron's axon will leave the ganglion and travel to the target organ that is being innervated. This diagram is kind of summarizing the differences between the somatic motor division and the autonomic motor system. So on the top you have a typical kind of somatic motor neuron pathway, I guess. So we're starting with the spinal cord here, and you have a lower motor neuron whose cell body is located in the spinal cord. Its axon is going to leave the spinal cord, travel along the anterior root of a spinal nerve, and then go down that nerve all the way until it gets to the skeletal muscle that it is contacting and controlling. The autonomic nervous system is shown on the bottom. In that case, for the autonomic nervous system, you have the cell body of your preganglionic neuron located in the spinal cord. Its axon is going to exit the spinal cord, again along the anterior root of a spinal nerve, and it's going to travel to a ganglion. Where that ganglion is located is going to depend on if we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system or the parasympathetic nervous system, but you're always going to have a ganglion that the preganglionic neuron's axon is traveling to. And again, a ganglion is just a ball of cells that is in the peripheral nervous system. So within that ball of cells, you have all of these postganglionic neuronal cell bodies. So the preganglionic neuron's axon is going to contact a postganglionic neuron, which is located in a ganglion, and then the axon of that postganglionic neuron is going to travel out of the ganglion the rest of the way down that nerve until it gets to its target organ. It's probably going to be contacting either smooth muscle in that target organ or a gland cell. In general, if this is a pathway that's in the sympathetic nervous system, then the ganglion that the postganglionic cell body is found in, that ganglion is going to be found close to the spinal cord. If this is the parasympathetic nervous system, then the ganglion will actually be found closer to the target organ and very far away from the spinal cord. So this diagram is also kind of just summarizing that general basic anatomical pathway that autonomic nervous information takes from the central nervous system to a target organ. So you always have a preganglionic neuron whose cell body is located in the spinal cord, usually. Actually, sometimes it might be found in the brainstem, but most of them are found in the spinal cord. The axon for that preganglionic neuron is going to leave the spinal cord, traveling along the anterior root of a spinal nerve, and it'll continue on down that spinal nerve until it gets to a ganglion. If this is the sympathetic nervous system, then that ganglion is going to be close to the spinal cord. If this is the parasympathetic nervous system, then the ganglion will be closer to the target organ. But you're always going to have a ganglion somewhere. Inside of that ganglion, you have the cell bodies of postganglionic neurons. So the axon of the preganglionic neuron is going to synapse onto the postganglionic neuron. then the postganglionic neuron's axon will leave that ganglion and travel the rest of the way to the target organ, whatever it may be. A final point of difference between preganglionic neurons and postganglionic neurons is just that your preganglionic neurons have myelinated axons, so they conduct action potentials very quickly, and the postganglionic neuron does not have a myelinated axon. It's unmyelinated, so it is conducting action potentials a lot more slowly than the preganglionic can do. So as I had mentioned, one major difference in the anatomical pathways for the sympathetic nervous system compared to the parasympathetic nervous system is just the location of the ganglion. For the sympathetic nervous system, the ganglion is found next to the spinal cord. For the parasympathetic nervous system, the ganglion is found closer to the target organ. There's also a couple of other differences. They're going to exit the central nervous system at different points. So for the sympathetic nervous system, nerves of the sympathetic nervous system are exiting from the central nervous system at the thoracic and lumbar spinal nerves. For the parasympathetic nervous system, its nerves are exiting in the sacral spinal cord and also certain cranial nerves, mostly the vagus nerve, but you also have a few axons for the parasympathetic nervous system that are exiting along nerves 3, 7, and 9. So this diagram is kind of summarizing those differences. On the top, you have the sympathetic nervous system. On the bottom is the parasympathetic. So for the sympathetic nervous system, your preganglionic cell body is going to be found in the spinal cord in either a thoracic segment or a lumbar segment. So its axon is going to exit the spinal cord either on a thoracic nerve or a lumbar nerve. It's going to travel a short distance until it gets to a ganglion in the sympathetic nervous system. That ganglion is going to have the cell bodies for the postganglionic neurons. So the preganglionic neuron is going to synapse onto the postganglionic neuron there in that ganglion. The axon for the postganglionic neuron is going to travel the rest of the way to the target cell, which would be, either a muscle or a gland in the target organ. Then for the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic cell body is going to be found either in the sacral spinal cord or it would be found in the brainstem. The axon of the preganglionic neuron is going to exit the central nervous system either along a sacral spinal nerve or along a cranial nerve. Probably it would be the vagus nerve. Most of the preganglionic neurons that have their cell body in the brainstem will be sending their axons out along the vagus nerve. The axon is going to travel most of the distance to the target organ before it encounters a ganglion. Within that ganglion, you have the cell bodies for postganglionic neurons. So the preganglionic's axon is going to synapse onto the postganglionic neuron, and the postganglionic neuron's axon is going to leave that ganglion and travel the rest of the way to the target cell on the target organ, and that's going to be a very short distance. These diagrams are just kind of, well, I guess this diagram on the left is kind of illustrating those differences again. So in the middle you have your central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. Green is for the parasympathetic nervous system and orange is for the sympathetic nervous system. So for the sympathetic nervous system, its preganglionic neurons are located in the spinal cord in the thoracic and lumbar segments. Their axons exit on the thoracic and lumbar spinal nerves, and they travel a short distance till they find a ganglion. These are some of the sympathetic nervous system ganglions. Ganglia actually is the plural. And then there's also some others that are a little further out from the spinal cord, but all of these ganglia are pretty close to the spinal cord overall. In the ganglia, the preganglionic neuron is going to synapse onto the postganglionic neuron. The postganglionic neuron always has its cell body located in that ganglion, and it's always going to be kind of close to the spinal cord. Then the postganglionic neuron will send its axon the rest of the way to the target organ, which would be kind of a larger distance. For the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons have their cell bodies either in the brainstem or in the sacral segments of the spinal cord. So their axons are either going to exit along a sacral spinal nerve or along a cranial nerve, probably the vagus nerve. They're going to travel a pretty long distance, going almost all the way to the target organ until they hit a ganglion. Inside of that ganglion, you have the postganglionic neuron cell bodies. So the preganglionic neuron will synapse onto the postganglionic neuron, and then the axon for that postganglionic neuron is going to travel the rest of the way to the target organ, which is going to be a short distance. And then this diagram is just illustrating the vagus nerve. So as you remember, that is the most important cranial nerve that actually descends all the way into the thoracic cavity and abdominal cavity. So it's actually contacting most of the organs within the thoracic and abdominal cavities. It's shown in green here. So all these little green lines are a part of the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is carrying those parasympathetic axons, parasympathetic preganglionic axons. They'd be traveling most of the way to the target organs before they hit a ganglion and synapse onto the postganglionic neuron. You also have some differences in terms of the neurotransmitters that are used by the SNS and PNS and the neurotransmitter receptors that are used by the SNS and PNS. So for the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons are always going to release acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter. That acetylcholine is going to cross a synaptic cleft and bind to receptors on the postganglionic neuron. Those receptors are going to be nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. So acetylcholine can be abbreviated as ACH. Nicotinic acetylcholine receptors can be abbreviated as NACHR. Once acetylcholine binds to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, it's going to activate them. That causes local potentials in the postganglionic neuron that eventually lead to action potentials if the stimulation is strong enough. Then the postganglionic neuron in the sympathetic nervous system is going to release norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter, which will travel across a synaptic cleft onto a target cell, either a muscle cell or a gland cell. Then on that target cell, which we could also call an effector cell because it's doing something, either contracting or releasing a substance, that target cell is going to have alpha receptors or beta receptors that are used to respond to the norepinephrine. So this diagram here is kind of showing the neurotransmitters and receptors used in the sympathetic nervous system. So you have your preganglionic neuron that is releasing acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter onto the onto the postganglionic neuron. That acetylcholine is going to bind its receptors, which is nicotinic acetylcholine receptors on the postganglionic neuron. The postganglionic neuron releases norepinephrine as its neurotransmitter, usually. Then that norepinephrine is going to bind to its receptors on the effector cells or the target cells. And those receptors are going to be either alpha receptors or beta receptors. Exceptions to that general scheme for the sympathetic nervous system, sometimes epinephrine is actually released as the neurotransmitter by the postganglionic neuron instead of norepinephrine, or actually I should say kind of along with the norepinephrine. So they'll release like a lot of norepinephrine and then also a little bit of epinephrine. Both norepinephrine and epinephrine activate the alpha and beta receptors that are on the effector cells. So they both kind of work the same way, basically. They have a tiny chemical difference between them. And then the more major, I guess, exception would be for sweat glands. The sympathetic nervous system controls your sweat glands. So in some cases, this effector cell would be a cell in a sweat gland. If that's the case, then the postganglionic neuron would actually not be releasing norepinephrine, it would be releasing acetylcholine instead. But that you actually, you don't need to know those exceptions for the test or anything, just the basic neurotransmitters and receptors that are used. So for the sympathetic nervous system, it's going to be acetylcholine released from the preganglionic neuron. The postganglionic neuron uses nicotinic acetylcholine receptors to respond, and it releases norepinephrine primarily. And the effector cells will use alpha or beta receptors to respond. In the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neuron is actually also going to release acetylcholine, and the postganglionic neuron will also respond to it using nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. Then the postganglionic neuron is going to release acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter, and effector cells are going to respond to that acetylcholine using a different type of acetylcholine receptor, so not the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, but actually muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. And the muscarinic acetylcholine receptor is abbreviated as MACHR. So that's kind of a lot maybe, but actually all of the neurotransmitters that are released by the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are just acetylcholine, with the one exception of norepinephrine released from postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic nervous system. So if in doubt, the neurotransmitter is probably going to be acetylcholine. Right, acetylcholine is released by SNS preganglionics, PNS preganglionics, and PNS postganglionics. Only SNS postganglionics release norepinephrine. Then the norepinephrine is responded to by effector cells by using alpha and beta receptors. For acetylcholine, when that's released by a preganglionic neuron, the postganglionic neuron will always respond using nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. And then muscarinic acetylcholine receptors are only used by effector cells to respond to acetylcholine from parasympathetic postganglionic neurons. The difference between the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors and the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors is, well, of course there's a difference in the function of the receptor, but the reason why they have that difference in their name is because of different substances that can bind and activate those receptors in the lab. So in the lab, you could use acetylcholine, of course, to bind and activate both of the types of receptors, but when you're trying to study just one type in the lab, you want to have some substance that will activate that type, but not the other types. So for the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, scientists found out that nicotine will activate those receptors and it won't activate other types of acetylcholine receptors. For the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, scientists found out that a chemical called muscarine will activate those receptors, but it doesn't activate other types of acetylcholine receptors. So that's why they have those names. So just a little bit more about those receptors used in the autonomic nervous system. So you have your nicotinic acetylcholine receptors that are used to respond to acetylcholine on or by postganglionic neurons in both the SNS and PNS. You also find those nicotinic acetylcholine receptors actually at the neuromuscular junction. So in the somatic motor division of the peripheral nervous system, you have your lower motor neurons that are traveling to a skeletal muscle. They actually release acetylcholine onto that skeletal muscle, and the skeletal muscle will have nicotinic acetylcholine receptors to respond. And then, of course, you also find those receptors in the autonomic nervous system in your ganglia located on the postganglionic neurons. The nicotinic acetylcholine receptor is an actual ligand-gated ion channel receptor. And it allows cations to cross through the channel, which means that when you open the channel, when you have acetylcholine bind to that receptor, the channel will open and positively charged ions will be able to travel through it. And the main one that's going to end up traveling through is sodium. So you're going to have sodium entering either your postganglionic neuron or your skeletal muscle, and that's going to depolarize that cell, and it's excitatory. So it's going to promote action potentials occurring. For the muscarinic acetylcholine receptor, that is located on your target organs in the parasympathetic nervous system. So when your parasympathetic nervous system is controlling an organ, it's going to send postganglionic axons to that organ. They're going to release acetylcholine onto that organ, and the cells of that organ will have muscarinic acetylcholine receptors that allow them to respond to stimulation by the parasympathetic nervous system. So when acetylcholine binds to those muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, then you have a response in the organ. But actually, the muscarinic acetylcholine receptor is not an ion channel receptor. So when acetylcholine binds, it's not just that a channel opens and you have a local potential arising. It's a little bit more complicated because it's actually a G protein coupled receptor. So that means that the muscarinic acetylcholine receptor can have lots of other effects on the target cells, not just causing local potentials. So that actually kind of makes sense because those receptors would be found in the peripheral nervous system. They would be found on target organs. So, you know, it's not actually a neuron. It's some other type of cell. Maybe it's a smooth muscle cell. Maybe it's a cell in a gland that would be making some type of hormone or something, or maybe mucus, something that is being secreted by this gland. So you're not going to have action potentials in those target cells. So you have these G protein coupled muscarinic acetylcholine receptors on those cells, and when the acetylcholine binds to the receptor and activates it, you're going to have either a change in the protein function of that target cell or a change in the gene expression, or both. And those changes are going to promote, you know, whatever functions the parasympathetic nervous system is causing to occur in its target organs. Actually, you can also find muscarinic acetylcholine receptors in the brain, and in the brain they're used by acetylcholine to promote wakefulness. Then finally, you also have alpha and beta receptors that are used in the autonomic nervous system. The alpha and beta receptor is actually short for the full name, so the full name would be alpha adrenergic and beta adrenergic receptors. Those are found again on target organs that are contacted by postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic nervous system. So your sympathetic postganglionic axons are going to be releasing norepinephrine onto these target organs, and the target organs will respond using alpha or beta receptors. Some organs have alpha receptors, some have beta receptors. And that's also a G protein coupled receptor. Well, both the alpha and beta receptors are G protein coupled receptors, so they are not ion channel receptors. When they're activated, you're going to have some type of change either in protein function or in gene expression in those target cells. Alpha and beta receptors will respond or be activated by norepinephrine, but they are also activated by epinephrine. And another name for epinephrine is just adrenaline. So epinephrine is released actually from postganglionic axons in the sympathetic nervous system, just a little bit. Mostly those axons release norepinephrine, but you do have a lot of epinephrine being released by your adrenal gland as a hormone. So when the sympathetic nervous system activates, you're actually also going to have the adrenal gland activate and start releasing epinephrine, also known as adrenaline. That adrenaline is going to travel all through your body, in your blood, and it's going to bind all these alpha and beta receptors that you find on target organs for the sympathetic nervous system, and it's basically just going to promote the effects of the sympathetic nervous system. Then the picture here is of the fly amanita mushroom, and that's actually the source of muscarine. So, of course, we all know what nicotine is, but muscarine, for which the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors are named, is actually derived from these pretty mushrooms. So just to kind of summarize all that information, for your sympathetic nervous system, that is associated with fight versus flight. It's going to contact most of the visceral organs in your body. You're going to have two cell bodies in the path for sympathetic nervous system information to travel to those target organs. First, you have the preganglionic neuron, then you have the postganglionic neuron. The preganglionic neuron cell body is located in the spinal cord, either in a thoracic segment or in a lumbar segment. Its axon is going to exit in a thoracic or lumbar spinal nerve and travel to a ganglion. The ganglion is going to be located close to the spinal cord. In that ganglion, the preganglionic neuron is going to release acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter, which will bind to receptors, specifically nicotinic acetylcholine receptors on the postganglionic neuron. The postganglionic neuron cell body is located in that ganglion. Its axon is going to travel out of the ganglion the rest of the way to the target organs. It's going to release mostly norepinephrine onto those organs as its neurotransmitter, also a tiny bit of epinephrine. That norepinephrine is going to bind to alpha or beta receptors on the cells in these target organs that the sympathetic nervous system is connecting to. Those alpha and beta receptors are also activated by epinephrine, not just by norepinephrine. Then in the parasympathetic nervous system, you also have the same two neurons in the pathway, first the preganglionic and then the postganglionic. Again, your preganglionic neuron is going to have its cell body in the central nervous system, but it would be at a different location, so either in the sacral spinal cord or in the actual brainstem. Then the axon for that preganglionic neuron is going to leave the central nervous system either along a sacral spinal nerve or along a cranial nerve, probably the vagus nerve. It's going to travel to a ganglion. That ganglion is going to be located close to the target organ. In the ganglion, the preganglionic neuron is going to synapse onto the postganglionic neuron, whose cell body is found in that ganglion. The preganglionic neuron is going to release acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter, which binds to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors on the postganglionic neuron. The postganglionic neuron then sends its axon the short distance to finally reach the target organ. And it's going to release acetylcholine onto those targeted cells as its neurotransmitter, and the target cells will respond using muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. And then in contrast to the sympathetic nervous system path and the parasympathetic nervous system path, you also have just the regular somatic motor path shown here, where you have a lower motor neuron whose cell body is in the spinal cord. The axon of that neuron travels to a skeletal muscle, and at that point where the lower motor neuron contacts a skeletal muscle, you have kind of a specialized synapse called the neuromuscular junction. And you're actually going to release acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction, and the skeletal muscle responds to it using nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. So now we'll go into the sympathetic nervous system in more detail, starting with actually a little bit more detail about its anatomy, and then finally we'll go into the details of its functions. And then we'll do the same for the parasympathetic nervous system. So we'll go into a little bit more detail on the anatomy of the sympathetic nervous system. For the preganglionic neurons in the sympathetic nervous system, of course, their cell bodies are in the thoracic and lumbar segments of the spinal cord, and their axons are going to exit along a thoracic or lumbar spinal nerve. So first, that preganglionic axon is going to travel down the anterior root of the spinal nerve, which is the root that carries motor information. Then the two roots will merge to form the actual spinal nerve, and then right away the spinal nerve will branch, and you have the posterior ramus coming off, and then the anterior ramus. So the preganglionic axons for the SNS will always travel in the anterior ramus, never in the posterior ramus. Then very quickly they're going to leave the anterior ramus and travel down the ramus communicans to a sympathetic chain ganglion. So previously we had introduced the idea of the ramus communicans in chapter 13 as coming off of the anterior ramus and leading to the sympathetic chain ganglion. Technically there's two rami communicantis for each spinal nerve. So you have the white ramus communicans traveling from the anterior ramus to the sympathetic chain ganglion, and then you also have a gray ramus communicans that is leading from the sympathetic chain ganglion back to the anterior ramus. So the preganglionic axons in the SNS are always going to travel down the white ramus communicans. Remember, the SNS preganglionic axons have myelin on them. The white ramus communicans is actually called that because it's full of myelinated axons. The gray ramus communicans, on the other hand, does not carry myelinated axons, so it doesn't have any SNS preganglionics on it because those are all myelinated axons. So your sympathetic nervous system preganglionic neuron sends its axon out down the anterior root, then the anterior ramus, then the white ramus communicans, and then it goes to the sympathetic chain ganglion. The sympathetic chain ganglion is right next to the spinal cord, and it's actually called a chain ganglion because it's attached to more sympathetic chain ganglia that are above and below it. You essentially have a line of these traveling down each side of the spinal cord just outside the spinal column. So your preganglionic axons can synapse right there in the first sympathetic chain ganglion that they come to. They could also travel up or down the chain to a different sympathetic chain ganglion. And there's also a couple of other options. So they can actually travel straight through the sympathetic chain ganglion and kind of come out the other side along a branch that's not really shown in this drawing. In that case, they would either be headed to a collateral ganglion or to the adrenal medulla. A collateral ganglion is a ganglion in the sympathetic nervous system that is closer to the target organ than the sympathetic chain ganglion is, but it's still overall closer to the spinal cord than to the target organ. There's 4 different collateral ganglia in the sympathetic nervous system, and you don't need to know which ones they are, but they are the preaortic ganglion, the celiac ganglion, and the superior and inferior mesenteric ganglia. So if your sympathetic preganglionic axon is traveling to a collateral ganglion, then that means that it goes to that collateral ganglion, and there you would have your cell body for the postganglionic neuron, and it would synapse on it. If it's traveling straight through the sympathetic chain ganglion and going to the adrenal medulla, then that's kind of more of a special case. In that case, you actually don't have a ganglion or a postganglionic neuron. It's just going directly to the adrenal medulla and causing the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine as a hormone. The adrenal medulla is actually the part of the adrenal gland that releases epinephrine or adrenaline. Alternatively, if it's doing kind of the more normal thing and the preganglionic axon is synapsing in a sympathetic chain ganglion, then of course you have your cell bodies for the postganglionic neurons in those sympathetic chain ganglia. So it would be synapsing onto a postganglionic neuron. So wherever your sympathetic preganglionic axon synapses is going to be synapsing onto a postganglionic neuron in the sympathetic nervous system, or it'll be just ending in the adrenal medulla. So if you are having that synapse in the sympathetic chain ganglion, then your postganglionic neuron has its cell body in that sympathetic chain ganglion, and its axon is going to exit the sympathetic chain ganglion, traveling along the gray ramus communicans. Remember that postganglionic axons are unmyelinated, so when you have them all traveling along the gray ramus communicans, then you get the appearance of gray matter, which is why it's called that. So this diagram here is kind of illustrating some of those options for what can happen with your postganglionic axon. So here we have a preganglionic neuron sending its axon along the anterior root, then the anterior ramus, then the white ramus communicans, and it could make a synapse here in the sympathetic chain ganglion. If it were to do that, then you would have your postganglionic neuron cell body in the sympathetic chain ganglion, and the axon for that neuron would travel along the gray ramus communicans back to the anterior ramus. Then it's going to travel down the anterior ramus and the various branches of the spinal nerve to get to the target organ cells. Then, of course, it's going to release norepinephrine onto those cells as a neurotransmitter, and the cells will have alpha or beta receptors to respond to it. Of course, your sympathetic preganglionic neuron's axon could synapse right there in the sympathetic chain ganglion that's at the same level that it exited the spinal cord at, or it could rise or fall in the sympathetic chain ganglion system, so it could go up to the next one and synapse there, in which case still you have a postganglionic cell body in that particular sympathetic chain ganglion whose axon would travel down the gray ramus communicans, then the anterior ramus, and ultimately to a target cell. The other options are that your sympathetic preganglionic axon can pass through the sympathetic chain ganglion without making a synapse. That would be shown by this branch right here. So in this case, this is still our preganglionic axon, and it is exiting the sympathetic chain ganglion, and it's going to travel, in this diagram is shown traveling to a collateral ganglion, which would be located closer to the target organ, but still overall closer to the spinal cord than to the target organ. It's just that it's not right next to the spinal cord the way that the sympathetic chain ganglia are. And then within this collateral ganglion, that's where you would have your cell bodies for the postganglionic neurons. So you have a synapse there between the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons, and the postganglionic axon is going to exit the collateral ganglion and travel the rest of the way to a target cell. And the last option is that the preganglionic axon could just travel directly to the adrenal medulla. That is not shown in that particular diagram. If it is traveling to the adrenal medulla, then you actually don't have a postganglionic neuron involved at all. Instead, it's just going to go to the adrenal medulla and sort of, not really synapse, but sort of synapse onto cells in the adrenal medulla that are producing hormone. Those cells are actually considered to be like modified neurons because they actually have local potentials. So you do have sort of like a synapse basically between the preganglionic axon and these hormone producing cells in the adrenal medulla, where the preganglionic axon is going to release its transmitter acetylcholine onto those cells, and they have nicotinic acetylcholine receptors that they use to respond, and instead of generating action potentials, they just release hormone. So here's another diagram showing the anatomy of the sympathetic chain ganglia along with the anatomy of the spinal nerves. This diagram is using the terms ventral and dorsal instead of anterior and posterior, but ventral is going to correspond to anterior and dorsal corresponds to posterior. So here you have a spinal nerve, and you have the two roots of the spinal nerve. You can always tell which one is which because of course, it's the posterior root that has the posterior root ganglion on it. So this must be the posterior root. That makes this the anterior root. Those two roots join to form the spinal nerve, which very quickly branches to form a posterior ramus and an anterior ramus. Then you have your white ramus communicans and your gray ramus communicans, leading to and from the sympathetic chain ganglion. Excuse me. So, if you had a preganglionic cell body for the sympathetic nervous system located in the spinal cord here, its axon would exit traveling along the anterior root, then along the anterior ramus, then it would travel down the white ramus communicans to the sympathetic chain ganglion. It might synapse there, it might fall or rise to the next sympathetic chain ganglion, or it might go straight through the sympathetic chain ganglion, headed to a collateral ganglion or the adrenal medulla. If it synapses here in a sympathetic chain ganglion, then it's contacting a postganglionic neuron whose cell body is located here in this ganglion. That postganglionic neuron is going to send its axon down the gray ramus communicans back to the anterior ramus, where it's going to continue on in the spinal nerve until it gets to its destination. Here again, we have more diagrams showing these options. So first, in the upper left-hand corner is just a diagram showing the basic anatomy of the sympathetic chain ganglion system. So here you have a line of sympathetic chain ganglia, and you can see it's traveling along the spinal column right next to it, and you have another line of sympathetic chain ganglia on the other side. So your spinal nerves are exiting the spinal cord. They're kind of obscured by the spinal column and the vertebrae for much of it, but you have your anterior root and your posterior root merging to form the spinal nerve proper. Then you have your posterior ramus branching off, and then the anterior ramus continuing on. And then in white is your white ramus communicans, and in gray is your gray ramus communicans. White ramus communicans travels into the sympathetic chain ganglion and it carries preganglionic axons. The gray ramus communicans travels out of the sympathetic chain ganglion and it carries postganglionic axons. And then you can also see some more nerves exiting from the sympathetic chain ganglia. traveling forward across the vertebrae. So if you have a sympathetic preganglionic axon that is just traveling straight through the sympathetic chain ganglia, traveling to a collateral ganglion or the adrenal medulla, it would be traveling in one of these nerves. And then we have a few more diagrams showing more detailed kind of circuit maps that have those actual axons drawn onto them. So first, the most simple case is where you have a preganglionic neuron with its cell body in the spinal cord, and it sends its axon out along the anterior root, then the anterior ramus, then the white ramus communicans to synapse there in the sympathetic chain ganglion that is at that same level of the spinal cord. So you would have a postganglionic neuron cell body there in that sympathetic chain ganglion. The postganglionic axon is going to leave the ganglion, traveling along the gray ramus communicans, going back to the anterior ramus, and ultimately traveling to its target cells. Alternatively, this preganglionic axon could exit the spinal cord, travel down the anterior root and the anterior ramus and the white ramus communicans to the sympathetic chain ganglion, and then instead of synapsing right there, it could rise or fall to another level of the spinal cord and synapse in a sympathetic chain ganglion at that new level. So in this case, it has risen to the next higher level of the spinal cord and synapsed onto a postganglionic neuron with its cell body in that particular sympathetic chain ganglion. Still, the axon for that postganglionic neuron is going to travel down the gray ramus communicans back to the anterior ramus and then ultimately to its target cells. Then finally, you have another option illustrated in which your preganglionic neuron has its axon exit along the anterior root and the anterior ramus, and then traveling down the white ramus communicans, but in this case passing straight through the sympathetic chain ganglion and leaving along one of these extra nerves that is emerging from those chain ganglia and traveling in this case to a collateral ganglion. Where it synapses onto a postganglionic neuron whose axon continues down this nerve ultimately to the target organ. And of course, the final case is actually not illustrated here, in which you have set up basically sort of similar to this, where your at least in the first aspect of it, where your preganglionic neuron is, having its sending its axon to exit the spinal cord along the anterior root, and then it travels down the anterior ramus, then the white ramus communicans, then passes straight through the sympathetic chain ganglion, but in this case it would be traveling not to a collateral ganglion but to the adrenal medulla. So that one is not illustrated. And again, one more diagram. This one kind of summarizing the different options for your sympathetic nervous system. So you have your preganglionics located in the spinal cord at the thoracic and lumbar levels of the spinal cord. Their axons will exit the spinal cord and travel to a ganglion, either in a sympathetic chain ganglion or maybe a collateral ganglion. And at that point you have your postganglionic neuronal cell bodies in those ganglia, and the axon for the postganglionic cell will travel the rest of the way to the target organ. And then the final case that we haven't really seen illustrated yet is that you have a preganglionic neuron in the spinal cord whose axon travels directly to the adrenal medulla and synapses onto specialized cells in the adrenal medulla. Those cells are actually called chromaffin cells. They respond to neurotransmitter released by the preganglionic neuron's axon, and then they release epinephrine or adrenaline in response as a hormone. So that basically covers the anatomy of the sympathetic nervous system. Now we'll get into the actual effects that it has on specific organs that it targets. So first, the heart is targeted by the sympathetic nervous system, and the SNS has two effects on the heart. It's going to increase the heart rate, and it increases the force of contraction, which means it increases the strength with which the heart is contracting. So both of those changes in the heart are going to increase the cardiac output. The cardiac output is the amount of blood that is pumped through the heart in a given unit of time, usually a minute. So when the heart is pumping faster, then of course you have more blood moving through it in every minute. And when the heart is contracting with more strength, then it's going to pump more blood with every contraction. And again, you're going to have more blood moving through the heart every minute. You also have effects of the sympathetic nervous system on the blood vessels. It causes vasoconstriction in some blood vessels, and it causes vasodilation in other blood vessels. Vasoconstriction is where you have smooth muscle in the walls of the blood vessels contracting, and that means that the vessel itself is going to kind of shrink and get smaller. Vasodilation is where the smooth muscle in the walls of the blood vessel is relaxing so that the vessel will get bigger. When you have the vessel vasoconstricted, that is going to increase the blood pressure, but it's also going to decrease the speed or the volume of blood that flows through. When a vessel is dilated, that is going to decrease the blood pressure and also increase the amount of blood that is able to flow through it. Just because it's bigger and it can hold more blood, therefore more blood can go through it. So the sympathetic nervous system is going to constrict all of the blood vessels that are traveling to organs in the digestive system, the urinary system, and the integumentary system, which is the skin. It's also going to constrict vessels that are traveling to most exocrine glands. And again, an exocrine gland is a gland that is producing some substance and secreting it onto a body surface, whether that's an external surface or an internal surface. So that's stuff like saliva, mucus, sweat. So it's going to constrict the blood vessels that are traveling to most exocrine glands, and the only major exception is just the sweat glands. So when you constrict all of those blood vessels traveling to the digestive, urinary, and integumentary systems and to the exocrine glands, then you are reducing the amount of blood that is going to reach those organs. And the reason for that is because you are theoretically in some form of emergency situation if your sympathetic nervous system is activating at a strong level. And so maybe you need to fight or run away from something. You're not going to need your digestive and urinary and integumentary systems to help you do that. And again, your exocrine glands, you're not going to need them to help you do that, with the exception of possibly your sweat glands, but those are not the vessels to the sweat glands are not constricted by the sympathetic nervous system. At the same time, the sympathetic nervous system is going to dilate blood vessels that are traveling to your skeletal muscles and to your heart, so that those organs will actually get more blood, and that means that they're supplied with more nutrients and they can, contract more to serve you in escaping your emergency situation. Overall, you're going to have more vasoconstriction when the sympathetic nervous system activates than you have vasodilation. Which means that overall the blood pressure is going to increase when you have the sympathetic nervous system activate. Also, the effects of the sympathetic nervous system on the heart to increase cardiac output will also increase blood pressure. So between your increased cardiac output and your vasoconstriction for many blood vessels, the sympathetic nervous system is going to cause blood pressure to go up. When blood pressure goes up, that makes it easier to kind of force blood to move through the blood vessels. It's also reducing blood flow to the specific organs that have constricted vessels, and it's increasing blood flow to the specific organs that have dilated blood vessels. Then you also have effects of the sympathetic nervous system on the lungs to dilate the airways in the lungs, which are called bronchioles. So when you dilate the bronchioles, that's called bronchodilation, and you also have bronchoconstriction, which is where you constrict those airways to make them smaller, but the SNS is going to dilate them and make them bigger. Then also the sympathetic nervous system will increase the rate at which you're breathing. So that's actually an effect that it's having within the brain itself and not directly on the lungs, because it's the brainstem that is controlling your breathing rate. So it's going to act in your brainstem to increase your breathing rate and act directly in the lungs to dilate your bronchioles or cause bronchodilation. Of course, when your airways are bigger, more air can fit through them, and when you're breathing, faster, you're getting more air in. So the effects of the sympathetic nervous system on the lungs are going to be increasing the amount of oxygen that is entering your blood from the lungs. And overall, the effects that the sympathetic nervous system is having on the heart, the blood vessels, and the lungs are going to increase the supply of oxygen and other nutrients to specific organ systems like the skeletal muscles and the heart that need, extra energy to fuel your emergency responses. The sympathetic nervous system also has effects on the liver, where it's going to trigger gluconeogenesis, or the production of glucose from, other things. It's also going to increase the breakdown of glycogen in your liver to form glucose, but overall it is increasing glucose production by the liver. Then the liver is going to, release that glucose into your blood, so it's going to increase your blood sugar. It also will cause changes in the adipose tissue, which is the fat tissue in your body. It's going to increase a process called lipolysis in your adipose tissue. In lipolysis, you break down fat and release glycerol. Every fat has 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol molecule, so when you break a fat down, you release that glycerol. That glycerol can travel in the blood to the liver, and the liver is able to convert glycerol to glucose. So ultimately, that's also increasing the blood sugar when you increase lipolysis in adipose tissue. And you have effects on the pancreas to increase the release of the hormone glucagon. Glucagon is sort of like the opposite hormone to insulin. So insulin decreases your blood sugar. Glucagon is going to increase your blood sugar. It has effects in the liver, where it just, increases glucose production. Is also acting on adipose tissue to increase lipolysis. So glucagon is basically kind of enhancing the effects of the sympathetic nervous system on the liver and on adipose tissue to increase glucose production in the liver and to increase lipolysis in the adipose tissue. All of these effects, the glucose production in the liver, the lipolysis in the adipose tissue, and the glucagon from the pancreas that reinforces those first 2 effects, those effects are all going to ultimately increase the amount of blood sugar that you have, thereby increasing the nutrients available for your skeletal muscles and your heart to use to help you in your emergency situation. It's also going to increase the glucose supply, basically for all organs. Because it's just increasing the amount of glucose in the blood, and all organs have access to the blood, but the specific organs that have their blood vessels vasoconstricted by the sympathetic nervous system are not going to get as much of that glucose because they're not getting as much blood. So organs in the digestive, urinary, and integumentary systems and most of your exocrine glands will not be getting the extra glucose, really. So that extra glucose is really more for the organs that have their blood vessels vasodilated, or the organs that don't have any real change in their blood vessels. So that would be the skeletal and cardiac muscle that have, dilated blood vessels, and then the lungs in your brain don't have any change in their blood vessels when the sympathetic nervous system activates. So they're also going to be getting increased glucose when the just content of glucose in the blood goes up. The sympathetic nervous system also has effects on the digestive system and the urinary system. In both of those systems, it's going to contract any sphincters that are in those systems. So that would be like, between your bladder and your urethra, you have a sphincter that's going to contract. Like between your stomach and your small intestine, you have a sphincter, that one will contract. So at various points throughout the digestive and urinary systems, you have sphincters that are kind of controlling the flow of either digested food or of forming urine to the next part of that system. Those sphincters will all contract. In the digestive system, you'll also have smooth muscle in the walls of the organs of the digestive system, and that smooth muscle is going to relax. So normally in the digestive system, you're going to have food that is propelled through your digestive tract by contractions in the walls of your intestines or your stomach, of whatever part of the tract we're in. So when you relax those smooth muscles, then you kind of stop moving food through the digestive system. Also, when you contract sphincters in the digestive system, you prevent food from moving to the next organ in the digestive system. And the same for the urinary system. When you contract sphincters in the urinary system, you prevent forming urine from moving to the next part of the urinary system. Of course, the blood vessels that serve the digestive system and the urinary system are going to be constricted by the sympathetic nervous system, and that's also going to affect the digestive and urinary systems because it means you're not going to get as much blood. And when you're decreasing the amount of blood that those systems receive, then they're not getting as many nutrients and their function is going to slow down. They can only really operate quickly if they're getting enough blood to have a lot of nutrients available. Overall, it's not, if you're having an emergency situation, then it's not really the time for the functions of the digestive and urinary systems. Like, you don't really need to be just digesting your food when you're trying to escape from a lion or something. So that's the reason why the sympathetic nervous system is going to restrict the function of those organ systems and kind of slow their function down a lot. You're basically prioritizing the body's resources, taking them away from digestion and stuff, and kind of shunting them towards, having more energy available for your muscles so you can run away. The sympathetic nervous system also has effects on the reproductive system. It inhibits arousal, but it actually is required for orgasm. So during the sexual response, you have to initially have the sympathetic nervous system kind of turned off, but then for orgasm, it has to kind of activate to support orgasm. You also have effects of the sympathetic nervous system on the adrenal gland, specifically on the adrenal medulla, which is the inner part of the adrenal gland. So the adrenal gland has kind of two parts. It has the adrenal cortex along the outside of it, and it has the adrenal medulla in the middle. Both parts produce hormones, but they produce different hormones. So the cortex, or the outer part, is producing mostly stress hormones, and the inner part is producing epinephrine, or also called adrenaline. The adrenal medulla, specifically, not the cortex, but the medulla, has preganglionic axons for the sympathetic nervous system coming into it and contacting specialized cells there called chromaffin cells. The chromaffin cells are basically modified neurons. So they have neurotransmitter receptors and they have local potentials, but they don't have action potentials or axons. So what they basically do is receive, stimulation from the preganglionic axon, and in response to that stimulation, they release hormone. The hormone they release is primarily epinephrine, also called adrenaline, but they also release some norepinephrine. So just like your sympathetic nervous system postganglionic neurons release norepinephrine for their neurotransmitter, but they also release a little bit of epinephrine. In the adrenal medulla, it's the same thing, but the other way around, where those cells are mostly releasing epinephrine, but also a little bit of norepinephrine. When epinephrine or norepinephrine are released from a postganglionic neuron, then they are neurotransmitters because they're being released by a neuron at a synapse or something very similar to a synapse between that postganglionic neuron and its target cell. When you have epinephrine or norepinephrine being released by chromaffin cells in the adrenal medulla, then it's not a neurotransmitter, it's a hormone. And it's a hormone because it's actually being released into the bloodstream. Whenever you have a signaling molecule that is released into the bloodstream, then it's a hormone. So if you have a neurotransmitter or something that would elsewhere be a neurotransmitter released into the blood, then it's not a neurotransmitter anymore, it's a hormone now. So basically, when norepinephrine and epinephrine are released from the postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system, they are neurotransmitters. When they're released from the adrenal medulla, they are hormones. That epinephrine and the little bit of norepinephrine that are released by these chromaffin cells in the adrenal medulla are going to travel in the blood all across the body. So they're actually reaching every cell in your body, and they're binding to those alpha and beta receptors, the same receptors that the sympathetic nervous system uses to stimulate target cells. To stimulate those target cells in response to activation by neurotransmitter from a postganglionic neuron. So the epinephrine from the adrenal medulla is going to bind to those alpha and beta receptors wherever it finds them all across the body and activate them. This is going to increase or enhance the effects of the sympathetic nervous system on its target organs, and it's also going to lengthen them or prolong them. So, for instance, in the heart, the sympathetic nervous system is increasing your heart rate and the force of contraction. So that means you have actual nerves traveling, carrying postganglionic axons for the sympathetic nervous system, traveling to the heart, and you have synapses between those axons and those postganglionic axons and the heart cells. And whenever the sympathetic nervous system activates, you're going to have activity at those synapses and the heart rate will increase, the force of contraction will increase. But then when you turn off the sympathetic nervous system, then you're going to not have any more stimulation at the heart by those postganglionic axons anymore, and so the heart rate would go, back down, back to normal. But when you have epinephrine that's released from the adrenal medulla in response to activation of the sympathetic nervous system, that epinephrine is going to last in the blood until something happens to get rid of it. So it's going to be in there for a while. That means that it's going to go to the heart and it's going to bind to those, actually it's beta receptors in the heart, and activate those beta receptors, which is going to increase the heart rate and the force of contraction in the heart. And when your sympathetic nervous system turns off, you actually still have that epinephrine from the adrenal medulla in your bloodstream. It takes a long time for hormones to be removed from your blood. So that's going to prolong the effects of the sympathetic nervous system on the heart. Even though your sympathetic nervous system is off, you still have epinephrine in the blood that is going to be increasing the heart rate and the force of contraction. Then this diagram here is basically finally showing the path that sympathetic nervous system preganglionic axons take to the adrenal medulla. So you start with a cell body in the spinal cord at a lumbar or thoracic level of the spinal cord. The axon of this preganglionic neuron is going to exit down the anterior root and then travel down the anterior ramus, then down the white ramus communicans. It's going to pass straight through the sympathetic chain ganglion and leave in another nerve coming out the back of the sympathetic chain ganglion, and it's going to travel the rest of the way to the adrenal medulla. So you don't have a postganglionic neuron involved here. Instead, your preganglionic neuron is going to synapse directly onto these chromaffin cells in the adrenal medulla and cause them to release hormone, epinephrine, and a little bit of norepinephrine. And it's hormone because it travels into the blood. Oh yeah, and then this is just showing where your adrenal glands are at. They're located on the tops of your kidneys. So here you have basically a summary diagram for the sympathetic nervous system. And we're showing here the sympathetic chain ganglia. So these would be located right next to the spinal column. So the spinal column would be, right here. So in kind of dark red going into the sympathetic chain ganglia, we have preganglionic axons in the sympathetic nervous system. Even though the sympathetic chain ganglia travel much of the length of the spinal column, you only have preganglionic axons entering the sympathetic chain ganglion system at the thoracic and lumbar levels of the spinal cord. Then they can rise or fall down to a higher or a lower sympathetic chain ganglion. Or they could synapse in the ganglion they're at, or they could travel through the sympathetic chain ganglia to a collateral ganglion, or directly to the adrenal medulla. In kind of orange, you have your postganglionic axons for the sympathetic nervous system, and you can see the different organs that they travel to. Most of those postganglionic neurons have their cell bodies in the sympathetic chain ganglia, but some of them have cell bodies in a collateral ganglion. And then when you have a sympathetic preganglionic axon traveling to the adrenal medulla, then you actually don't have a postganglionic neuron involved at all. So we didn't actually go over all of the effects of the sympathetic nervous system on different organs. For instance, we didn't mention that in the eye, it causes dilation of your pupil, which just helps you take in light so you can kind of see better. So you don't need to know literally all of the effects that it has. We kind of covered like the most major ones, but it actually has a lot of different effects on many, many different organs. But to summarize kind of the major ones, in the heart, the sympathetic nervous system is going to increase the force of contraction and increase the heart rate. Both of those effects serve to increase the amount of blood that the heart is pumping for any given amount of time. In the lungs, the sympathetic nervous system is going to cause bronchodilation. It is also increasing the rate of breathing. Technically, that's controlled by the brainstem, but that does, of course, also affect the lungs. So that is increasing the amount of oxygen that gets into your blood when you dilate those airways and increase the breathing rate. Then you have effects on blood vessels. The blood vessels that serve the integumentary system, which is the skin, are going to constrict, so the skin will get less blood. That's why you may appear pale if your sympathetic nervous system activates. Sweat glands will actually be stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. If you are more active, then you're going to need to cool down, so the sympathetic nervous system will make you sweat. It is also going to dilate the blood vessels that serve your skeletal muscles, so they will actually receive more blood, therefore also more oxygen and more glucose, more nutrients, so that will help them contract. The blood vessels that serve your heart are also going to be vasodilated, so the heart is receiving more nutrients as well. Then you have your abdominal organs. In the liver, the sympathetic nervous system is going to be increasing the production of glucose. It's actually not shown in this diagram, but you would also have adipose tissue in which you're increasing lipolysis, increasing the breakdown of fat, and that provides more raw materials for the liver to make glucose out of. Here you have the pancreas. The sympathetic nervous system is going to increase the release of glucagon from the pancreas. The hormone glucagon is then also going to increase lipolysis in adipose tissue, and it will increase the rate of glucose production by the liver. So those effects are all serving to increase your blood sugar or increase the nutrients available in your blood. The sympathetic nervous system is going to be acting on your stomach and intestines and basically the organs of your digestive system to decrease their activity. Specifically, it's going to be contracting sphincters throughout the digestive tract. It's also going to be relaxing smooth muscle in the walls of the digestive tract. That means that food is not going to be moving through the digestive tract very quickly. It also is going to vasoconstrict the blood vessels that serve the digestive system, which means that the digestive organs will receive less blood, and that slows down their function as well. In the urinary system, the sympathetic nervous system is going to also contract sphincters, preventing the flow of urine through the system. It's also going to constrict blood vessels that serve the urinary system. That will also decrease the function of the urinary system because it will be receiving less blood and therefore less nutrients. And then the sympathetic nervous system is also contacting the adrenal medulla and causing it to release the hormone epinephrine, also called adrenaline. That epinephrine is going to be traveling to all of the different organs that are affected by the sympathetic nervous system, and it's going to increase and prolong the effects of the sympathetic nervous system on those cells. So now we'll cover a little bit more on the anatomy of the parasympathetic nervous system and then the specific functions or effects that the parasympathetic nervous system has on its target organs. So happily, the anatomy of the parasympathetic nervous system is a good deal more simple than it is for the sympathetic nervous system because you don't have any involvement of the sympathetic chain ganglia or the white and gray rami communicantis. So for the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons have their cell bodies either in the brainstem or in the spinal cord at the sacral segments of the spinal cord. if the preganglionic neuron has its cell body in the spinal cord, then its axon is going to exit the spinal cord, traveling along the anterior root of the spinal nerve, and it'll be a sacral spinal nerve. Then when the spinal nerve branches into the posterior and anterior ramus, it will travel down the anterior ramus and then just travel down the nerves until it gets to a ganglion. For the sympathetic nervous system, the ganglia that it uses are either terminal ganglia or intramural ganglia, and they're going to be very, very close to the target organs. So the preganglionic neuron's axon is going to travel almost all of the way to the target organ until it gets to a ganglia, a terminal or intramural ganglion. And then it's going to synapse onto the postganglionic neuron, which will travel the rest of the way to the target cells. So that diagram is showing a parasympathetic preganglionic axon where the cell body for that neuron is located in the spinal cord, but of course it could also be located in the brainstem, in which case the axon for the preganglionic neuron is going to exit in a cranial nerve. It'll probably be exiting in the vagus nerve, and it'll travel in the vagus nerve or whichever other cranial nerve it is in until it gets again to either a terminal ganglion or an intramural ganglion, where it will synapse onto the postganglionic neuron. So this diagram is basically comparing the anatomy for the sympathetic nervous system to the parasympathetic nervous system. For the sympathetic nervous system, of course, it's a good deal more complicated. You have your preganglionic neurons located in the thoracic and lumbar segments of the spinal cord. Their axons are going to exit along the anterior root, then travel down the anterior ramus of a spinal nerve, then down the white ramus communicans into a sympathetic chain ganglion. They can synapse onto a postganglionic neuron right there in the sympathetic chain ganglion, or they can travel to a different sympathetic chain ganglion, either above or below, and synapse there onto a postganglionic neuron, or the preganglionic neuron can have its axon just exit the sympathetic chain ganglion without synapsing and travel to a collateral ganglion and synapse there onto a postganglionic neuron, or of course it can travel all of the way to the adrenal medulla. For the parasympathetic nervous system, it's much more simple. You have a cell body for your preganglionic neuron, perhaps located in the sacral spinal cord or else located in the brainstem. If it's in the sacral spinal cord, its axon will exit along the anterior root, then travel along the anterior ramus until it gets to a ganglion that is very close to the target organ, either a terminal ganglion or an intramural ganglion, and there it will synapse onto the postganglionic neuron. If the preganglionic neuron cell body is in the brainstem, then it's going to exit. Its axon is going to exit along a cranial nerve. Probably it would be the vagus nerve, and travel almost all of the way to the target organ until it reaches a terminal or intramural ganglion, and there it will synapse onto the postganglionic neuron. So for your postganglionic neurons in the parasympathetic nervous system, their cell bodies are going to be located either in a terminal ganglion or an intramural ganglion. Those two ganglia are very similar. The terminal ganglion is very close to the target organ, and an intramural ganglion is actually located in the wall of the target organ. So it's kind of incorporated into the target organ. So this diagram is kind of showing the difference between those two types of ganglia. This is a terminal ganglion, so it's very close to the target organ, but it's technically, outside of it. And this is an intramural ganglion where it's actually embedded in the wall of this target organ. Intramural ganglia are especially common in the gastrointestinal tract, so like the stomach and the intestines. And you actually have an extensive network of intramural ganglia and axons of neurons that are traveling through the walls of the gastrointestinal tract, and that's called the enteric nervous system. The intramural ganglia are kind of unique amongst ganglia in the peripheral nervous system because they are exposed to an unusually high level of mechanical stress. So just there's a lot of pushes and pulls on them, especially when they're embedded in the walls of the gastrointestinal tract. Of course, as that tract expands with food, the ganglia will be stretched. So they're subject to a lot of stress. So your postganglionic neuron will have its cell body in a terminal or intramural ganglion. If its cell body is in a terminal ganglion, then its axon is going to travel a very short distance until it gets to its target organ. If its cell body is in an intramural ganglion, then it's also going to travel a short distance, but it's basically already starting at the target organ, so it's just going to travel along the target organ, like in the wall of the target organ. So now we'll get into the specific effects that the parasympathetic nervous system has on its target organs. Starting with the heart, the sympathetic nervous system increases the heart rate and it increases the force of contraction, but the parasympathetic nervous system only decreases the heart rate. It actually has no effect on the force of contraction in the heart. This diagram is showing how the heart is innervated or contacted by axons from the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So you can see that the sympathetic nervous system in yellow sends axons to the SA node in the heart and the AV node in the heart. These are parts of the heart that are controlling the rate of contractions and how contractions spread throughout the heart. But you also have sympathetic axons that are traveling down to the main body of the heart, and these are just contacting the muscles in the ventricles of the heart, which is the largest chamber of the heart that's going to provide most of the force for contraction. So the sympathetic nervous system is affecting not only the heart rate, but also the force with which these heart muscles contract. For the parasympathetic nervous system, it only sends axons to the SA node and the AV node. It doesn't send any axons to the muscly part of the heart, so it doesn't affect how the heart is contracting or with how much force it is contracting. It only affects the heart rate. The parasympathetic nervous system also has effects on the blood vessels, but they are mostly indirect effects. So as you may remember, the blood vessels are the major organ in the body that is not innervated by the parasympathetic nervous system. So it is only innervated, only controlled by the sympathetic nervous system, and the parasympathetic nervous system does not send axons to the blood vessels. There's only one exception to that, which is for blood vessels that serve the reproductive system organs. So therefore the parasympathetic nervous system doesn't really have a direct effect on the blood vessels except in the reproductive system organs, but it does still indirectly affect them. And that's just because anytime the parasympathetic nervous system activates, in general, the sympathetic nervous system is going to be inhibited. And that's just occurring at the level of the brainstem. So whenever the parasympathetic nervous system turns on in the brainstem is going to turn the sympathetic nervous system off in general, which means that whatever changes the sympathetic nervous system would have caused in the blood vessels, whatever changes the sympathetic nervous system had caused in the blood vessels, they're going to reverse when the sympathetic nervous system turns off because the parasympathetic nervous system has just turned on. So when the sympathetic nervous system activates, it is going to constrict blood vessels that serve the digestive, urinary, and integumentary systems, and also the blood vessels that serve most exocrine glands, and it's going to dilate the blood vessels that serve the skeletal muscles and the heart. So those changes are going to reverse whenever the sympathetic nervous system turns off. So if the parasympathetic nervous system turns on, then the SNS will turn off, and your vessels serving the digestive, urinary, and integumentary systems and most exocrine glands that had been constricted, now they're going to dilate. The vessels that serve the skeletal muscle and heart muscle that were dilated are going to constrict. Actually, for those vessels serving the skeletal muscles and the heart, they're not going to constrict a lot. Especially for the heart, you never want those vessels in the heart to be like very constricted because the heart always needs to have a reliable supply of blood. Actually, for the skeletal muscles, they only really need a large supply of blood if they're actively contracting. But of course, the heart is always actively contracting, so it always needs a good supply of blood. So the blood vessels that serve those muscles are not going to constrict a lot when the parasympathetic nervous system activates and the SNS turns off. They're only going to constrict a little bit. For the reproductive system organs that have their blood vessels actually directly innervated by the parasympathetic nervous system, when it activates, those blood vessels are going to dilate. So overall, the parasympathetic nervous system is dilating blood vessels that serve the digestive, urinary, integumentary, and reproductive systems, and most exocrine glands, and is constricting blood vessels that serve the skeletal muscles and the heart. Most of those effects are indirect and just based on inhibition of the sympathetic nervous system whenever the parasympathetic activates. In the lungs, you also have effects of the parasympathetic nervous system. It is going to cause bronchoconstriction, which means that the airways or the little bronchioles in the lungs are going to tighten or get smaller. The smooth muscle that surrounds them will tighten and the airway will get smaller. In general, it doesn't cause a lot of bronchoconstriction because, of course, that's not good. You always need space for air to travel through the airways in your lungs, so it's never good for them to get very constricted. But in certain disease states, then you might have a more significant constriction of the airways. So this image here is showing an airway at rest, so kind of at its normal diameter, and an airway during an asthma attack. So this yellow stuff here is mucus that is filling up and clogging the airway, but you can also see that it's constricted. All these little red bands around it are smooth muscle bands, and when they are relaxed, then the airway can be big, but when they constrict or when they contract, then the airway is going to get constricted. So normally when the parasympathetic nervous system activates, these smooth muscle bands are going to contract, but only a little bit, so it's not going to squeeze the airway as much as this one is squeezed, and of course it also wouldn't be clogged with mucus. But if you have more of an extreme response to the parasympathetic nervous system's effects in the lungs, then you could get constriction that's very tight like this. The parasympathetic nervous system will also decrease the breathing rate, but again, that does not occur directly in the lungs. Instead, that occurs in the brainstem because the breathing rate is controlled by the brainstem. So the effects that the parasympathetic nervous system has on the heart are going to decrease the cardiac output or decrease the amount of blood that is being pumped by the heart in every minute. The effects of the parasympathetic nervous system on the blood vessels are going to lower blood pressure. Some vessels are constricting, some are dilating, but overall a lot more vessels are dilating when the parasympathetic nervous system activates than how many are constricting, which means that overall you have vasodilation, and that's always going to drop blood pressure. So these are basically just the opposite effects that the sympathetic nervous system has on these organs, with a couple of exceptions. So for the SNS, that's going to increase heart rate and increase force of contraction. For the PNS, it only decreases the heart rate. It does not affect the force of contraction. And for the SNS, it constricts vessels that serve the digestive, urinary, integumentary systems and exocrine glands, while it dilates vessels that serve the skeletal muscles and heart. Whereas for the parasympathetic nervous system, it is also affecting the reproductive system blood vessels. The purpose of lowering the cardiac output and the blood pressure with the parasympathetic nervous system is just to reduce the amount of strain that is put on the heart and on your blood vessels. So when you're having kind of an emergency situation that you need to respond to, then it's important to have increased cardiac output and increased blood pressure so that you can increase the oxygen and nutrient supply to all of your organs, like your skeletal muscles, that you need to help you deal with that situation. But you wouldn't want to be in that state kind of all of the time, because when the heart is beating quickly, that's kind of hard for the heart to keep up with over a very long period of time. It needs a chance to relax. and recover. And when your blood pressure is always high, that also puts a lot of strain on your blood vessels because they have to contain that very high pressure fluid, the blood. And some of the blood vessels are quite delicate. So if you have a high heart rate and a high blood pressure for an extended period of time, you will end up with cardiovascular disease. So the parasympathetic nervous system, when it activates, it's reducing the amount of strain that's placed on your heart and your blood vessels so they can be preserved to function correctly for, for your whole life. The parasympathetic nervous system also has effects on other organs in the body, such as the liver, where it decreases glucose production. Also the pancreas, where it increases insulin production. So for the sympathetic nervous system, it affects the pancreas by increasing glucagon production. Glucagon is the hormone that increases blood sugar. Insulin is kind of like the opposite hormone. It's the hormone that's going to decrease blood sugar by causing cells to take up glucose from the blood. The pancreas also secretes digestive enzymes into the intestines, and the parasympathetic nervous system stimulates it to do so. So for the sympathetic nervous system, the only effect it has on the pancreas is to increase glucagon secretion, but for the parasympathetic, it actually has two effects. First, to increase insulin production, and second, to increase the production of exocrine digestive enzymes into the intestines. The parasympathetic nervous system also has direct effects on exocrine glands to stimulate their secretion, basically for all exocrine glands except for sweat glands. So that's kind of different from how the sympathetic nervous system affects exocrine glands. Actually, the sympathetic nervous system really does not directly affect exocrine glands except for sweat glands, which it does stimulate. The sympathetic nervous system instead has indirect effects on exocrine glands by decreasing their blood supply by constricting blood vessels that serve them. So, anytime you constrict those blood vessels that serve the exocrine glands, you're going to reduce their blood flow, and that means you're going to reduce their activity. For the parasympathetic nervous system, it does indirectly affect exocrine glands by increasing blood flow to them, by inhibiting the SNS and therefore dilating the blood vessels that serve exocrine glands, but it also has direct effects on most exocrine glands except for the sweat glands to stimulate their secretion. In the digestive system, it basically does the opposite of the SNS. It relaxes sphincters instead of contracting them, and it contracts smooth muscles in the walls of the digestive tract instead of relaxing them. And specifically, the smooth muscles in the walls of the gastrointestinal tract are stimulated to contract in this coordinated pattern called peristalsis, in which you have a ring of the muscle that contracts, and then that contracted ring will kind of slide down the gastrointestinal tract. So it's kind of like a wave of contraction. So peristalsis is what is illustrated in this GIF image here. So you can see these waves of contraction moving down the intestines. So that is peristalsis. And that is stimulated by the parasympathetic nervous system. Also in the urinary system, the parasympathetic nervous system has effects that are basically the opposite of the sympathetic nervous system effects on the urinary system. It's going to cause sphincters to relax instead of contract. So its effects on the digestive system and the urinary system are increasing the function of those systems by stimulating fluids or food to move through the system. Also, it indirectly increases the activity of the digestive and urinary systems by increasing their blood flow, by dilating blood vessels that serve them. Overall, the parasympathetic nervous system is basically increasing your kind of rest and digest functions. So it's increasing activity of the digestive system, so you digest food and take those nutrients into your blood. It increases insulin production to help your cells take up glucose from the blood and start using those nutrients that have entered the blood. And it also is increasing the passage of waste in the urinary system and the digestive system. So we will finish this chapter up by going over, in a general way, how the autonomic nervous system coordinates homeostasis in the body. So this slide is showing basically different aspects of homeostasis that are controlled by the brain, including the autonomic nervous system. So homeostasis is just the maintenance of stable internal conditions that are necessary for life. So that includes a lot of different things. That includes like maintaining your body temperature within a certain range, maintaining your blood pH, maintaining the amount of water in your blood. It also includes regulating how much sleep you get and how much food and water you take in. So there's a lot of different aspects of homeostasis. In general, homeostasis is controlled by the brain and by the hormones of the body, but the hormones are mostly also controlled by the brain. So this diagram is showing different parts of the brain and how they connect to control homeostasis. So at the top you have the cerebral cortex and the amygdala. The cerebral cortex is, of course, the cortex. So that's including, in the front, your logical faculties. It also includes all the sensory information that's coming into the brain and into your conscious awareness. So all of that sensory information and kind of information about your internal state is going into lower parts of the brain to help control homeostasis. And then the amygdala is involved with regulating emotions, so your emotional state also affects how your brain is controlling homeostasis. The amygdala and the cerebral cortex are both sending information to the hypothalamus, which of course is the part of the brain that kind of integrates the higher and lower functions of the brain. So it's integrating the cortex with the brainstem to help control homeostasis. It also has the master clock of the brain, and it controls hormones. And you can see that the hypothalamus is sending input to the brainstem. The cerebral cortex also sends input to the brainstem, specifically to the reticular formation within the brainstem, which is a series of different nuclei located in the brainstem that actually have a lot of different functions, but some of their functions include maintaining homeostasis and controlling the autonomic nervous system. So within the reticular formation, you have these autonomic centers, which are specific nuclei within the reticular formation that are in charge of your autonomic nervous system, both the sympathetic branch and the parasympathetic branch. Then you also have other nuclei in the reticular formation that are involved in homeostasis as well. So the hypothalamus is directly controlling your body temperature, also your food intake and your fluid intake. So those aspects of homeostasis are basically entirely controlled by the hypothalamus, also in conjunction with some hormones in your body, of course. But those hormones are, of course, themselves under the control of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is also sending information to the reticular formation, so it does help control homeostasis that is controlled through the brainstem and through the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system itself is in charge of your heart rate, your blood pressure. That includes how much blood your different organs are getting, because the autonomic nervous system can constrict or dilate blood vessels that are serving different organs. It can control how much blood flow they are receiving. It's also controlling the activity of your digestive system and your urinary system and your basic metabolic rate. And then you have other nuclei in the reticular formation of the brainstem that are controlling other aspects of homeostasis, like your breathing rate, your sleep cycles, and acid-base balance in the blood. So basically your pH, the pH of the blood. Although of course the respiratory rate is also influenced by the autonomic nervous system. And that's actually not shown in this diagram, but it is true. So you can see here that the autonomic nervous system is basically in direct control of most aspects of homeostasis, not all of them, but very many of them. And the autonomic nervous system is under the control of the brainstem. So it's the brainstem that is most directly controlling output of the autonomic nervous system and therefore homeostasis. But you also have the hypothalamus in the mix that independently controls a few aspects of homeostasis, like the body temperature, and it's also sending information to the brainstem to help the brainstem better control homeostasis and better control the activity of the autonomic nervous system. And in particular, the hypothalamus is receiving a lot of information from higher brain areas like the cortex and the amygdala, so that the brainstem will be controlling homeostasis in a way that is kind of integrated with the way that you are functioning as a person and kind of the higher brain functions that you have. So up to this point, we've kind of been talking about the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system like they're kind of either on or off, but that's actually not the case. They're actually on all the time, and that is the autonomic tone. Autonomic tone is the activity in the different branches of the autonomic nervous system when you are at rest, so without any other form of stimulation. So you have two types of autonomic tone. You have sympathetic tone and parasympathetic tone. Sympathetic tone is the activation of the sympathetic nervous system at rest. Parasympathetic tone is the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system at rest. Of course, when you're at rest, the parasympathetic nervous system should be dominating because that's the system that's associated with rest and digest. But you also have the SNS active at rest. Particularly, the sympathetic nervous system is active in the blood vessels when you are otherwise at rest. So you have a significant sympathetic tone in your blood vessels. That means that your blood vessels are always like partially constricted, or at least the blood vessels that serve your digestive, urinary, and tegumentary systems and most exocrine glands are always partially constricted. That's actually very, very important, and if you lose that baseline sympathetic tone, you will die. So here you have, images of blood vessels. The normal sympathetic tone that you have that causes those blood vessels in the digestive, urinary, and tegumentary systems and most exocrine glands to be partially constricted, that would basically make them look kind of like this. So they have kind of a medium diameter. Then if the sympathetic nervous system activates more, the vessels will constrict more to be quite small in diameter, and that's vasoconstriction. Or if the SNS decreases its activity because the parasympathetic nervous system turned on more, then you're going to have those vessels dilate, so that's vasodilation. So normally those vessels should all be basically at this medium diameter. If you were to lose that sympathetic tone, all of your vessels would dilate. At least all of the vessels in the digestive, urinary, and integumentary systems, and the ones serving most exocrine glands, except for the sweat glands, would all dilate. They would all basically completely have the smooth muscle in their walls relax, and they would reach their maximum diameter. If that happens, your blood pressure is going to drop. And it's going to actually drop so low that you're not able to maintain blood flow to your organs. You have to have a certain level of blood pressure in order to force the blood to actually move through the blood vessels. If you don't have that blood pressure, then it's not going to go anywhere. So it's kind of like if you have a garden hose and some water's coming out through it, but you need to spray some plants that are kind of on the other side of the yard. You're going to put your thumb over the opening of the hose to decrease its diameter, and that means that the water is going to start spraying out of the hose at a much higher rate and a much higher pressure. When you release your thumb, then the water starts flowing much more slowly out of the hose. So if you dilate all of your vessels at once, the blood is going to start flowing much more slowly through your blood vessels. And it's actually not going to be fast enough to supply all of your organs with sufficient oxygen, and you will die. that is called neurogenic shock. When the sympathetic nervous system just basically completely turns off and all of your vessels dilate at the same time, that is neurogenic shock. Shock is basically any time that you don't have enough blood flow to your organs to supply them with enough oxygen to kind of survive, and then they start dying. If the shock is happening because your sympathetic nervous system just turned off, that's neurogenic. Another term for this, for the baseline activation of the SNS in your blood vessels, is vasomotor tone. So the vaso there refers to the blood vessels. Motor refers to the muscle constriction in them. So vasomotor tone is the baseline level of constriction in your blood vessels that's caused by the baseline activation of the SNS or your sympathetic tone. For the parasympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic tone is going to dominate in other organs of your body at rest, including your heart and the digestive and urinary systems. So of course it's important to have parasympathetic tone in your digestive and urinary systems. That way they always function. If your parasympathetic nervous system completely turns off, then you're basically going to have all those sphincters in those systems constrict, and that's going to make it very difficult for them to function. Also for the digestive system, you would essentially have peristalsis really slow down a lot, and that's going to make it very difficult for you to digest your food. In the heart, the parasympathetic nervous system dominates to decrease your heart rate. If you don't have any autonomic tone at all in your body, so the SNS and the PNS are both completely off, your heart will continue to beat because it doesn't need the nervous system to beat. It'll beat by itself, but it'll be at kind of a higher rate. For most people, it'll be at about 100 beats per minute, which is actually pretty high. It's not good for you to have your heart beating that fast all of the time. It should be significantly lower than that. And actually in general, the lower the better. So when you have parasympathetic tone dominating in the heart at rest, that means that your heart rate is going to be lowered down below 100 BPM at rest. So it'll be maybe more like 80 BPM, or if you're kind of in good shape, maybe it'll be more like 60 BPM. So that's much healthier for you, and it really reduces the amount of strain that is placed on your heart through your daily life. One word that's kind of used as a synonym for parasympathetic tone is vagal tone. Vagal tone is the baseline activity in the vagus nerve at rest. Most axons in the vagus nerve are actually parasympathetic preganglionic axons. So it's axons for the parasympathetic nervous system. So when you have baseline activity in the vagus nerve, that's basically the same thing as having baseline activity of the parasympathetic nervous system. So if you ever hear about vagal tone, that's talking about, parasympathetic tone. If you ever hear about like vagal stimulation of the vagus nerve, that means stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system. A lot of the time the vagus nerve is kind of referred to as though it's the same thing as the parasympathetic nervous system because so many parasympathetic axons travel in the vagus nerve. So your autonomic tone in the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems is going to be kind of changing throughout the day based on your changing state throughout the day. You do have like a daily rhythm for your autonomic tone, for your sympathetic tone and your parasympathetic tone. So it'll be at one level when you're asleep, at a different level in the morning when you wake up, at another level in the evening when you're kind of getting more tired. So it varies on that daily basis, and that's all informed by, of course, the hypothalamus, which has the master clock. So all of those daily rhythms in the brain are based upon the activity of the master clock. But your autonomic tone will also vary based on different situations that you encounter during the day. So for instance, if you start exercising, that's going to change your autonomic tone. The parasympathetic tone will go down, sympathetic tone will go up. Also, if you're standing, that's also going to affect your autonomic tone. Or if you're stressed out, those things will all increase the sympathetic tone and decrease the parasympathetic tone. The autonomic nervous system, and specifically autonomic tone, has a major role to play in the development of homeostatic disease. homeostatic disease is just any kind of chronic long-term disease that is involving dysregulation of your homeostasis. So something about the way your body is maintaining some form of homeostasis is kind of breaking down or not working correctly, and that's homeostatic disease. Between the autonomic nervous system and the hypothalamus and hormones, those are your major, I guess, players in controlling homeostasis. But of course, the hypothalamus is also controlling the hormones. In general, to be healthy, you would want to have kind of a lower sympathetic tone and a higher parasympathetic tone. So you should have that balance between the SNS and PNS tone, where there's more PNS tone and less SNS tone. Even if you're kind of otherwise healthy, if you have too much sympathetic tone, that's actually potentially dangerous, and it is a predictor for sudden cardiac death. Which would be basically, some adverse cardiac event occurs in your heart, and your heart is not able to continue beating, and then you die. And it's difficult to predict those types of events, especially in a healthy person or an otherwise healthy person. But one way that you can kind of predict that the risk is higher for that type of event is if a person has a higher SNS tone than what is healthy. That imbalance between the SNS tone and PNS tone, where you have a heightened SNS tone, is also associated with homeostatic diseases like diabetes, metabolic syndrome, depression, and cardiovascular diseases, such as heart failure. For all of these homeostatic diseases, we're generally not 100% sure what causes them or exactly how they develop. Or how to treat them, but they all are associated with too much activation of the sympathetic nervous system at rest, and they're also all associated with low levels of inflammation over a long period of time. So the SNS and inflammation, those are both things that should kind of activate at a high level when you need it, and then they should turn off. But when your SNS is kind of always on at a higher than regular level, or when you have inflammation that's always happening, that seems to put stress on different aspects of your system, and that stress leads to, or I guess I should say, is associated with these diseases in some way. So just because inflammation and heightened SNS tone is associated with diabetes, it doesn't mean that they're causing diabetes. It just means that every time you see diabetes, you also see inflammation and heightened SNS tone. So it's not clear if the diabetes caused the inflammation and the SNS tone to go up, or if it's the other way around. But they always go together. So, they've got something to do with each other, that's for sure. The heightened SNS tone is especially evident with heart failure. In heart failure, the heart is weakened for one reason or another, and then it has a hard time providing enough blood for the body and for itself. Initially, we tried to treat heart failure by giving drugs that would increase or stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. Basically, we figure if the heart isn't pumping enough blood, then you should make the heart beat faster, and then it'll pump more blood. So that seems to make sense. But actually, when the heart beats faster, it does pump more blood, but it also increases its own oxygen demands. It needs to have more oxygen in order to pump faster. And the heart was already having trouble meeting its oxygen demands. So when you make it pump faster, then it becomes even more difficult for the heart to meet its oxygen demands, and then it's more likely that the heart will sustain additional damage. So when you do treat heart failure using drugs that stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, initially it seems that the person gets better, they have an easier time kind of moving around and doing activities, but then they die faster because their heart is being damaged at an increased rate. So we stopped doing that. Now we use beta blockers to treat heart failure. Beta blockers bind to beta receptors and basically prevent them from activating. So alpha and beta receptors are the receptors that are used by target organs to respond to stimulation by the sympathetic nervous system. And in the heart, it uses beta beta receptors. So when you apply beta blockers, those beta receptors on the heart basically shut down. Then when the sympathetic nervous system signals the heart to kind of speed up its heart rate, the heart can't respond because its beta receptors are shut down by the beta blockers. So when you give someone beta blockers, that's going to not necessarily lower their heart rate, but it's going to prevent their heart rate from speeding up when the SNS tells it to speed up. Initially, people will have their symptoms kind of get worse, where it seems like it's harder for them to do activities, but actually they live for a lot longer when you treat them with beta blockers, because the heart is not speeding up, therefore it's not increasing its oxygen demands, therefore it has an easier time meeting its own oxygen demands, and it doesn't sustain damage so much. Sympathetic tone actually has kind of a role to play in the development of heart disease without treatment as well. So, your body, whenever it senses that organs are not getting enough blood or enough oxygen, its basic response is to speed up the heart rate. Just to have more blood be pumped, and then more oxygen will be delivered to your organs. But of course, that's basically the same thing as treating the heart failure with drugs that increase your sympathetic nervous system activity. If the brain is increasing sympathetic nervous system activity in order to increase your heart rate, it's going to have the same negative effect on the heart. So even though it's not exactly clear for a lot of these homeostatic diseases exactly what role the sympathetic tone is playing in the disease development, it does appear that having a lower sympathetic tone and a higher parasympathetic tone is healthier and is not associated with these disease states. So it's probably a good thing to pursue. In general, the only really reliable way that we know to increase parasympathetic tone while decreasing sympathetic tone is just to exercise. And we actually don't know why that is, but people who exercise regularly have a lower heart rate at rest, and that is basically indicating that they have a higher parasympathetic tone and a lower sympathetic tone at rest. If you have a high heart rate at rest, that's an indicator that you have a higher sympathetic tone and a lower parasympathetic tone. So basically exercising and especially cardio exercise or aerobic exercise is kind of the most reliable way to improve the function of your autonomic nervous system and increase your parasympathetic tone to decrease your resting heart rate. And just one note I'll make is that you always want to make sure that you are being safe when you exercise. It is of course possible to injure yourself by exercising too intensely or with more intensity than what your body can handle. So you want to make sure that you're kind of starting slow, paying good attention to your body and how you feel, and not pushing yourself beyond what your body can reasonably do. And your body will be able to handle more exercise over time as you keep exercising at a reasonable pace. The most important thing is that you honor your exercise habit, not that you exercise very intensely every time that you exercise. Even for people who have heart failure, exercise is helpful. So if you have a disease like heart failure or some other cardiovascular condition like that, or asthma or something, then you do need to be careful about how you're exercising, because you're putting a lot of strain on your system when you exercise, and you want to be careful that it doesn't exceed what your heart can handle or what your body can handle. So you would want to definitely talk to your doctor about how much exercise would be appropriate for you. But if you have a disease like heart failure, you're not going to be doing really intense exercise. But even if you're doing a more moderate exercise that your body can handle, it does still actually improve your parasympathetic tone and reduce your sympathetic tone, and it helps reduce the severity of the disease. It really helps to manage the disease, and in some cases even treat the disease. In general, all of these homeostatic diseases can improve with the proper amount of exercise, especially cardio exercise, although weightlifting is helpful as well.